So here I wanted to share some really wonderful and instructive quotes from Hui Hai. Hui Hai was a Chinese Zen master. Now, for those of you who know a bit more about Zen, you'll know that Zen is actually a Japanese word. And before Zen made its way to Japan, it was known as Chan in China. So this is actually Chan master Hui Hai. And I'm going to quote some excerpts from his wonderful book called The Zen Teaching of Instantaneous Awakening. I'm going to use the John Blofeld translation of the Zen Teaching of Instantaneous Awakening. So let's have a look at some quotes. So the first quote starts off with Hui Hai speaking. And this is what Hui Hai says. He says, "The Shurangama Sutra says, perceptions employed as a base for building up positive concepts are the origin of all avidya," which means ignorance. Perception that there is nothing to perceive, that is nirvana, also known as deliverance. So Hui Hai is basically saying that there's a sutra or a text that says that the perception that there is nothing to perceive, this is liberation, this is nirvana. So the questioner then asks a really good question. The questioner says, what is the meaning of nothing to perceive? So Hui Hai has said that the perception there is nothing to perceive, that is nirvana, also known as deliverance. And the questioner is saying, what is the meaning of nothing to perceive? Let's listen to Hui Hai's response, which is wonderfully instructive. Hui Hai says, "Being able to behold men, women, and all the various sorts of appearances, while remaining as free from love or aversion, as if they were actually not seen at all, that is what is meant by nothing to perceive." So Hui Hai is saying, seeing all these different forms and appearances, men, women, and the like, but remaining free from love, which is a movement towards something, or aversion, which is a movement away from something, as if they were not actually not seen at all. That is what is meant by nothing to perceive. Okay, so I hope you got that. I'm now going to jump to another quote from the same text, which talks along the similar lines. This time the questioner is asking about right view. So the questioner asks, what is the right view? And Hui Hai replies, to perceive without perceiving any object whatsoever is the right view. The questioner then responds, again with a very simple question. What does to perceive without perceiving any object whatsoever mean? And Hui Hai is going to give his answer much along very similar lines to what we saw in the previous quote. Hui Hai replies, perceiving all sorts of things without grasping, that is, not being clouded by the arising of any thought of love or hate, etc., is perceiving without any objects. If one can see without seeing any objects whatsoever, that is using the Buddha eye, which is like no other eye. On the other hand, if one sees all sorts of things that cause thoughts of love and hate, etc., to arise, that is known as perceiving objects with ordinary eyes, and sentient beings have no other kind of eyes. This is true likewise with all of the other sense organs. So again, Hui Hai is saying that the key thing is to perceive without grasping, without desire or aversion, or as he puts it in this text, love or hate. And when you perceive without that distorting force or influence of grasping, without grasping, when you see without grasping, that is as if there are no objects there, then this is called the Buddha eye. And it's just clear seeing. Whereas when that desire or aversion is there, then you're seeing objects, as individual objects. And you're immersed in an apparent world of objects. And he calls that the ordinary eye, or seeing with your ordinary eyes. And that makes you what they call here a sentient being, which means a limited entity. as opposed to the Buddha seeing with the Buddha eye. Okay, I'm going to jump again to another quote. And what I'll do, I'll put links to all these quotes in the video description below, just so you can see where they're taken from, and you can see a bit more of the context and maybe read them again in your own time. But the next quote I'm going to read is something that Hui Hai is saying, and this is what he says. And this is a very quick, very short quote, and Hui Hai is telling us how we can enter into nirvana. It's very simple. Have a listen. He says, "Just let things happen without making any response, and keep your minds from dwelling on anything whatsoever. For they who can do this, thereby enter nirvana." Again, just let things happen without making any response, and keep your minds from dwelling on anything whatsoever. For they who can do this, thereby enter nirvana. So I hope you can see the thread that lies throughout these 3 excerpts I've read to you. What we haven't really spoken about is how this can be done, or I haven't really talked about teachings that facilitate this entering into nirvana, or allow one to let go of desire and aversion, or desire, fear, love and hate. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to read a few quotes of Hui Hai's which allow us to, that talk more about another aspect of the teaching, which is more about our true nature. And these 2 teachings of letting go of desire and fear, which we can call purification, which he calls in the text samadhi, and the perception of our true nature, how these 2 aspects of the teaching go together. So I'm just going to read you now a quote talking about true nature. See if you can see what it's pointing to in your own direct experience. So this excerpt starts with the questioner asking a question. The questioner asks as follows: "That which occurs when we are confronted by all sorts of shapes and forms is called perception. Can we speak of perception taking place when nothing confronts us?" So what the question is asking is that when we're seeing shapes and forms, when we're seeing objects, we can call that perception. But is there such a thing as perception when there are no objects, when nothing confronts us? Hui Hai gives a very straightforward answer. He says, yes. So the questioner has a follow-up question. He asks, when something confronts us, it follows that we perceive it. But how can there be perception when we are confronted by nothing at all? Now Hui Hai gives another very instructive answer. Hui Hai says, "We are now talking of that perception which is independent of there being an object or not. How can that be? The nature of perception being eternal, we go on perceiving whether objects are present or not. Thereby we come to understand that, whereas objects naturally appear and disappear, the nature of perception does neither of those things, and it is the same with all your other senses." So we can see that Hui Hai is pointing at something which he calls is eternal. Eternal means timeless. The nature of perception, he says, is eternal. So we're talking that eternal perception that's there, irrespective of whether objects are appearing or not. So the questioner has another follow-up question. He says, when we are looking at something, does the thing looked at exist objectively within the sphere of perception or not? Hui Hai answers, no, it does not. And the questioner asks another question. The questioner says, when we look around and do not see anything, is there an absence of something objective within the sphere of perception? And Hui Hai says, no, there is not. The questioner says, when there are sounds, hearing occurs. When there are no sounds, does hearing persist or not? And Hui Hai says, it does. And he means it does persist. The hearing continues even in the absence of sounds. And the questioner asks a very similar question when he was talking about the sense of looking or vision. And he asks a follow-up question about hearing now. The questioner says, when there are sounds, it follows that we hear them. But how can hearing take place during the absence of sound? And Hui Hai answers in the same vein. He says, we are now talking of that hearing which is independent of there being any sound or not. How can that be? The nature of hearing being eternal, we continue to hear whether sounds are present or not. And then we're going to conclude this excerpt, this quote, with the last question and answer. The questioner says, if that is so, who or what is the hearer? And Hui Hai answers simply, it is your own nature which hears, and it is the inner cognizer who knows. Okay, so I'm going to end this this reading of quotes with a couple more quotes, just two more quick quotes that should hopefully summarize or encapsulate what we've already spoken about. So the first, we're going to go with the questioner, coming back with a question. Here's the question. Is the nature of the absolute a true void or not really void? To describe it as not void is to imply that it has form. Yet to describe it as void implies mere nothingness. So what would then be left for sentient beings to rely on in their practice for attaining deliverance? So the question is saying, is our true nature, is the nature of the absolute, is it void or empty, or not void, not empty? If you say it's not empty, that means it has form, and form comes and goes. And so how can the absolute, our true nature, have form? Yet to say it's empty or formless implies nothing there. And so if there's nothing there, how can people, sentient beings, how can they rely on something that's not there to attain deliverance? So let's see what Hui Hai says in response. This is what he says. He says, the nature of the absolute is void and yet not void. How so? The marvellous substance, and he puts the word substance in quotes, the marvellous substance of the absolute, having neither form nor shape, is therefore undiscoverable. Hence it is void. Nevertheless, that immaterial, formless substance, in quotes, contains functions as numerous as the sands of the Ganges, functions which respond unfailingly to circumstances. So it is also described as not void. So he's saying it's essentially formless. It's a formless substance, but in it appears numerous forms as numerous as the sands of the Ganges, and these spontaneously function according to the apparent circumstance that appears within it. Okay. The last quote I'm going to read is later on from the same excerpt. And this is just Hui Hai speaking. He says, you should know that setting forth the principle of deliverance in its entirety amounts only to this. When things happen, make no response. Keep your minds from dwelling on anything whatsoever. Keep them forever still as the void and utterly pure without stain, and thereby spontaneously attain deliverance. Okay. So I hope these quotes were of use to you. I hope you enjoyed my reading of them, and I hope they are, as I said, of benefit for you. Okay. My love to you all, wishing you well. Bye for now.